of you have probably heard, I'm the new chair of the National Association of Flight Instructors as of this year. Okay. Now, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but if you'd like to give me a smile, a nod, or a wink, if you're a NAFI member, I'd appreciate that. Oh, that's nice. Thank you very much for your membership. And of course, anyone can join NAFI if you care to. Those of you that have been to AirVenture are probably familiar with this. This is just one of the many things NAFI offers, is that AirVenture, our series of presentations for the flight instructor community, are what we call a professional development center. Now, this isn't from AirVenture. This is something I did fresh and new just for you, but it's an example of the kind of program you can see there. So we're going to tuck into this pretty quickly. I noticed our speakers, our keynote speakers, we're talking about things like culture and impact. And it really hit me. It's like, what is the impact I'd like to give you out of this? Now, you know, impact is kind of a scary word in aviation, isn't it? So we're looking for the positive impact. So I'm really hoping you can come away with are ways you could, if you're flight instructors. How many of you are flight instructors? Yay! How many of you are DPEs? Okay, I know you're going to be nodding when you see some of these things I talk about. So the impact I'm hoping you take away is the positives to help improve the examination outcomes. Okay. Now I consider myself more of a flight instructor. So I do about 10 to 15, sometimes 18 exams a month, but I'm primarily a flight instructor. So my heart's with you, okay? So this can help raise a little bit of that curtain, but also, as you're going to see, there's certainly some things as a community or individually we can consider as ways to improve. Okay, because what we really want, you know, NAFI and any of our flight instruction organizations is the idea that we want to promote public awareness of flight instruction as a profession, a career, and that means we have to be professionals, right? So you're going to see some things here. You can decide for yourself, is this what a professional would have taught a candidate? Okay, so see what you can take away from this. All right, and I've got the whole, I've got the usual initials behind my name. All right, so here we come into an exam day, and again, this is just picking out some things. I could give you a 3-day presentation, but I don't have enough time. So on an exam day, what do we have? Well, we have the whole pre-exam portion. That's all that paperwork we have to get through before we ever can start the exam. Now, as a flight instructor, please have your people understand that, because I know what happens is sometimes someone goes, oh my God, that was a 5-hour exam. No, it wasn't. You were with me for 5 hours. That included all this paperwork before we ever did the exam, and included the debrief afterwards. So the oral, the ground portion was probably only about an hour and a half, 2 hours. The flight portion was probably about an hour and a half to 2 hours. Okay? That's not a 5-hour exam. And sometimes they're longer, but that's not the exam. That's usually unpreparedness. Okay? So what happens? After we get the pre-exam work done, we get into the ground portion, then the flight portion, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about attitude. You'll see what I'm trying to get at the point there. So, on your exam day, how do you feel as a flight instructor? How does your candidate feel? Are they like, oh my God, here comes the exam? You're both feeling this way a little bit? Hopefully not. Hopefully this is the way you and your candidate both feel. You got it, right? Okay. Oh, am I cutting you off here? Okay, so let's talk first about the pre-exam paperwork. And again, we have to do all of this before we get in there. I'm not listing all the pre-exam paperwork, but I can tell you, as a DPE, one of the things I make a point of doing, I communicate with every candidate and their flight instructor before the exam. One of the things I send them is a detailed list. Make sure you are PIC. Please verify you've got all these things done. I give them the specific citation, for example, for the 621-107 that they need to have complied with. That's a big miss on that one. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But again, what can happen? If everything's in beautiful order, we get through the pre-exam paperwork in about 25-30 minutes. Yay! Now we can get onto the ground. Not so good. Kind of not bad. Maybe it takes an hour. The ugly, hour and a half or more. I have 2 pre-exams that took 2.5 hours before we ever got to the exam. Now, for both of those candidates, if they had more than 1 exam that day, they never would have got the exam because there wouldn't have been time. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about why it could possibly take that long. Okay, so this is the good. This is the way I'm a candidate in the CFI field. There's the kind of, it's getting long, and then we've got the, right? So how do you think we all feel after that 2.5 hours of paperwork? And the exam ain't even started yet. Okay, so what's the problem? Okay, one time we get there, and now this isn't at my home base. I go to other airports, so I always stress, make sure you have confirmed the facility, everything's good to go, you've got the printer, internet connection. I get there, it's locked. Okay? We sat there for a half hour waiting for someone to show up, making phone calls. Okay, so finally someone shows up just to unlock the front door. So now we're in the little foyer. So I'm like, well, there's a table here, let's sit down and start doing the pre-exam paperwork. And then after another 20 minutes, someone comes in and unlocks the office. So now we move into the more enclosed office. Another 20 minutes, someone comes in and finally unlocks the classroom, the privacy where we were supposed to be. So we moved 3 times in the first hour and a quarter. And again, what are we doing? We're picking up, moving everything, and now we're going to start looking at paperwork. Okay, pilot logbooks. Okay, so there's a lot of issues with logbooks. I get everything from get a candidate, and they just meekly, they just hand me the logbook. Like, there's no tabs. It's pretty clear. They've never opened it. They just hand it to the CFI. And there's some writing in it. Every single thing in it is all of the CFI's handwriting, right? What is the odds that this candidate is going to properly fill out their logbook once they're a private pilot, hopefully that day, right? They've never done anything with it. So that could be an issue, because then when I see that, I ask them to show me something in the logbook, because they're PIC, right? And it's on that list I sent that please be prepared to show me things in your logbook. So I might say, hey, can you show me when you did your long cross country? Oh, then they're starting, where can I find this? All right. Yes, see, the DPEs are going, yeah. All right. The electronic issues. So one of these marathon sessions was I got there, and the candidate had printed out from his electronic logbook that he had met all qualifications. Okay. What alerted me right away, now in this case, when I saw the 8710 form, IACRA, I always like to review that in advance, but they hadn't completed it till like 11 o'clock the night before, and I met him at 8 o'clock in the morning. So in that case, I didn't get to see it. I take one look at it, it's a miracle. He's a private pilot, first-time candidate. He has more PIC time than solo time. Isn't that amazing?
Amazing.
And the instructor recommended that, okay? So I'm like, can you show me how you came up with this? So he pulls out this beautiful printout from the electronic logbook. What a mess, okay? So apparently he explained his CFI had given him the first couple, and after that he just took it over. He had no idea what he's doing. He had dual log that wasn't dual, he had solo wrong, it was a mess. So clearly the CFI had he'd say like, sign this, okay, you're good. Okay? So if you work with people with electronic logbooks, please teach them how to do it. Look over their shoulder, make sure they're doing it right, because again, that could be a real mess. Okay? So we took literally 2.5 hours and cleaned up that logbook. That's how messy it was. Yes?
What would you call it? If you're doing 2 a day or even 3?
Well, so on both of these if there had been 2, there would have been no way. Both of them were the only candidate that day. When it was clear it was taking a long time, it's like, let's take a break, let's talk about this. Is this going to work for you today? Because they're going to be dead tired. I know that. I'm good to go. I'm used to it. It's an endurance thing. But, they have to decide. So both of them decided to continue. Ultimately, they were both successful. Okay? But don't want to tell you what a long day it was. Okay. Missing signatures. Okay, CFIs are busy. I mean, I'm a busy CFI. You might have 5 lessons in one day, and you're filling out logbooks fairly rapidly. If I see a missing endorsement, can I accept that? No. So, please take your time. review, you know, before you send someone, make sure those entries are correct, okay? Now, one of the big missing things is technically, if you look at the 61107, it says, now this is your flight maneuvers primarily, you have logged flight and ground on those. Now, when you teach someone steep turns, I know you're doing ground with them, but did you log it? Okay, so I see it all the time. They've logged all these flight maneuvers, but they didn't log the ground portion of that. Normally, you've got a separate column that says ground. Put some time in it. You know, you said you worked on steep turns. Put some time in the ground, because I know you did the ground with them. So all of those flight maneuvers also technically require ground. If you're not familiar with it, read 61107, okay? Missing endorsements. Oh my, so. It's just. I just did an exam within the last 2 weeks, 4 missing endorsements. This was one of the marathons, okay? That's painful. There are endorsement guides out there, you know? So, and again, I send this to the candidate. Their PIC, they should be familiar with making sure they have met all the requirements, okay? So again, please verify if you haven't missed endorsements. Okay, and this one's painful too. They haven't met the required activities. Okay? I had a gentleman who flew his own aircraft 45 minutes to meet me at an airport. I was looking at his logbook, and he had logged exactly 10 night landings. And I said, okay, because it didn't say full stop, but I'm kind of kind, you know. So I said, how many of those were touch and goes? And he said, 5 or 6. You can't take it back at that point. So and the thing is, he had gone through 5 instructors. His last instructor had listed the requirements and checked them all off. But he didn't meet them, did he? So we had a nice conversation. I rescheduled him, but he hadn't met the requirement. Also, I had a sad case, night takeoffs. Technically, it says night takeoffs and night landings, okay? So there's typically you don't see a column for takeoffs, but be aware of the requirement, because if they have where they've logged 10 night landings exactly, but the whole flight wasn't at night, how in the heck did they get 10 night takeoffs, right? Can't start the exam if they don't meet the requirements, okay? I've had several cases where people have missed the solo landings at a towered airport. Where that tends to occur is a flight instructor who had previously worked at like Class Delta, Class Charlie, so they start not realizing, not thinking about that. And then their candidate comes and looking at it, like, where did you go for your towered? And I get that, oh. So that one can happen also. And a misunderstanding about cross-country. Now remember, cross-country requires a leg, your 3-leg cross-country, where it has to be 50 nautical miles distant from the point of departure, okay? So if you do 40 miles, then 60, and another 40 back, you didn't match, you didn't make it, because it was only B to C that was the more than 50, okay? So sometimes that misunderstanding comes in. And the whole issue of aircraft information. Now, I'm supposed to verify the aircraft is airworthy before we ever start the exam. You can't start the exam if the aircraft's unairworthy, right? So, can you show me the registration? Oh, it's in the plane. Okay. How about the airworthiness certificate? It's in the plane. Now, this was on the list of things to bring to the exam. They go, do you want me to get it? Where's the plane? Oh, it's only about a football field away, right? So again, it's the preparation here. And remember, aircraft information, we have to verify it's airworthy, all right? So, what happens when you go through one of these marathons, right? Okay, so, this is how we feel afterwards. Yay, we made it through the marathon. Or is this what goes on, right? So, do you really want to put your candidate through that and think about the flight instructor, how are you feeling too? You're, what's going on in there, right? Okay. Oh, and I always invite the flight instructor to stay through the whole pre-exam, of course, you know? So, but is it worth the risk? you know, people are already getting fatigued. They may need to reschedule if there's not enough time. So again, preparation. Okay, let's talk a bit about just some of the selected ground topics here. Okay, personal minimums, regulations, airworthiness systems. I could actually list every single ground topic, but I just picked out a few. Okay, personal minimums. So, are they a myth or are they a reality? Okay, so why do I ask this? Because more than once I've had this kind of case, and this one really sticks out to me. So I had a gentleman, he was one of those, the Zero to Hero accelerated program, 2 weeks. The strongest wind he'd ever experienced was 5 knots, right? The limitation the instructor wrote down for him was 8 knots, right? He could, and that day we had 19 gusting to 25. He's good to go. So he's telling me, oh yeah, we're good to go. So I said, huh, really? And then I asked him, how would you adjust for gusts, right? One of the things we teach, no idea. Okay? And I've had people when it picked up gusty and they're putting in 40 degrees of flaps for landing. That's where it gets a little scary, right? Okay, but remember, I'm a passenger. I could be a fearful passenger, but I'm a passenger. Now, on this exact scenario I've just talked about, what happened, so he starts mulling it over. I'm thinking, you know, don't make the decision to go because then you really have a problem. So I said, let's take a break while you think about it. Why don't you check the weather again, knowing he'd talked to his CFI, right? He comes back in with the CFI, and the CFI says, well, he goes, the wind's almost right down the runway, and he goes, and if you go to another, you know, if he has to divert to another airport, and, you know, and the winds are a little strong there, he could just return here. You know, he had that all worked out. And I said, what if it was a mechanical issue? That silenced him. And then I said, well, I'm a passenger, and they both nodded, and I happen to know the CFI fairly well, who has 2 young children. I said, by the way, what are your daughter's ages? He said 5 and 7. I said, oh, so you'd send them out as passengers today, right? And he kind of said, can we take another break? And they came back and rescheduled. Okay. All right. So how does the person, now a lot of people I notice, they'll come in with these wonderful personal minimums all written down, right? But have they really thought about what they are? So I had one where the person confidently told me, well, their crosswind is 25% less than the crosswind limit. Now, I know you see an issue with that right away, right? Is there a crosswind limit? No, it's demonstrated, right? So of course I said, well, what's that number? And he said, well, 25% less. And I said, okay. I said, I'm just playing, what is the crosswind limit? Okay, oh, no idea, right? So he pulls out, it was like a C model 172, so he's pulling out the little tiny, he had enough time to read the whole thing, you know, it's so thin. He couldn't find anything, right? So then it finally dawned on him for the first time, he had no idea for decision making what that number would be for him, okay? Now, another candidate told me very confidently, yep, I've got a 45-minute VFR fuel reserve, that's my fuel reserve. I said, how'd you get that? He goes, well, it's 50% more than the regulations. And I said, oh, okay, so if you come, you know, let's say you go on a 3-hour, you know, nice cross country and you come back, how much would you have left in the tanks with a 45-minute fuel reserve? This was a Skyhawk. So we did a little calculation and he kind of blanched. I said, would you be comfortable having basically 3 gallons in each tank on landing? And he goes, I think I want to increase that. Okay? But again, they have to, if you use scenario in your training, they're going to see all this applies. Okay, and then I'll ask them, just, you know, it depends on if this is something I want to get into a little bit more. What's the widest runway that you would be comfortable landing on? Right? And what's the widest run you have? They've never thought about these things. Okay? What about a slope? Would you be comfortable landing on a sloped runway? What about the surface? Have you ever landed on grass? Okay. What about going to an airport for the very first time? You know, so I can set up an Eastlake scenario. Your good buddy, you just met someone at a, you know, an EAA event, and they've got their own private strip, and they said, why don't you come in and land? Well, so I tell them, it's 1,800 feet long, it's grass, there's no obstacles. So then they get to show me in the charts, you know, the calculation. Okay? But if you think about it, as a CFI, if they pass their private exam, what would stop them from flying into this airport the next day? Right? So you might want to talk to them, have them use scenarios to have them really think about what their personal minimums are, because they're making those decisions right away, aren't they? And they could get into trouble if they haven't really thought it through. I really like to point out one of the runways back home in Wisconsin. We have hundreds of grass strips. So I tell them it's true. So the airport where I take my own aircraft for maintenance widened its runway 50%. Now the runway's 30 feet wide. Okay, let's talk just a little bit about regulations. So really, I'd like to point out, so something that's not examined, but so I don't cover in the exam, but I cover it out of the exam, because I think this is really important information. One is to have them familiar with the FAA compliance program, because they're afraid of the FAA, right? Maybe good reason, maybe not, but typically it's like, stay away from the FAA like the IRS, right? So I like to discuss the compliance program. I've done a fair amount of training for people under the compliance program, including in the last year, a tail dragger that was inverted the day after ownership, and someone that trashed his 172 on a gusty crosswind landing. Both totaled aircraft, compliance program. Neither one grounded, just the FAA saying you need a little more training. Okay, so that's kind of kinder and gentler, isn't it? So usually after I talk about the pilot bill of rights, I'll bring that up a little bit. And this is all pre-exam. Now on the aviation safety reporting system, well, this is just good practical knowledge. Now I find about half the time they're familiar with this because they're flight instructors, so congratulations for you to bring that up, because for good practical information for active pilots, they really should know about the aviation safety reporting system. How to use it. I'd say it's so simple. Call up the one-page form, just point it out to them, give them a scenario or two when to use it so they're aware of it. Okay, it could be very beneficial to them. Okay, now remember, on their knowledge test, any area where they had what the FAA calls a subject matter deficiency, wrong answer, has to be examined. Okay, so sometimes I find people come to the exam and it's like, really? I don't see a lot of sign of them having had additional training on that content. Okay, it's going to be examined, so please make sure they really are comfortable with whatever that area is. And I agree with you. Sometimes that subject matter code really doesn't give you a lot of guidance as to what the content is. Okay, but you can relate that back to the ACS and just make sure you cover that area for preparation. Okay. And as I mentioned, I'm a huge believer in scenario-based applications and training. I have about 40 of them so far, scenarios that I send people for the cross country, and to a person, I really like that. They really get into it because we may have an artificial passenger in the back seat, who's a good reason for a lot of maneuvers. They want to turn and they want to photograph things, they want to slow down and look at things, they want to experience those things that they saw on YouTube called stalls. So, there's scenario based. So we really get into the scenarios. Okay? Let's talk about airworthiness. Okay? So again, the certificate and registration, I mentioned that. They need to prove that you have that for the aircraft. Very few private pilot applicants are aware that the O is really operating limitations. When you get to an aircraft like mine, I have an RV6 experimental, my operating limitations are one-page sheet of paper. That's it. So it's not the POH, it's not the AFM, it's operating limitations. And your more modern POHs, it's actually Chapter 2. Okay. The VOR check. Now, Aviate. So everyone's memorized Aviate. So okay, how do you know the plane's airworthy? Oh, Aviate. Sometimes they'll even write it down for me, right? So annual, and then they go VOR check. I go, oh, okay. I said, so we need that for airworthiness? Yeah. Can you show that to me? Oh. Okay. So not everyone's familiar with the fact that you don't need it unless for instrument you're using it, okay? But it also says in the private that if it's one of the areas the DP chooses to examine, they should know when you do it, why you do it. That's pretty important. I mean, think about it, even for VFR, would you want an inaccurate VOR, non-operating, if you're planning on using it? Where they get the information from to figure out where is going to be their, you know, is there ground-based facility for testing? Is there VOT available? You know, and how they do it. So I find because of this world of GPS, there seems to be a greater and greater lack of knowledge about not only utilization of the VOR, but how do you test it for the accuracy, okay? And again, you can tell them, and sometimes people can cite it, and they'll just repeat it, and they say, have you ever done one? No. So it's always a good idea to show them how to do it, right? What are the odds they're going to do it if they've never been shown how? Okay. Now, owned aircraft. So I had a person who had gone through all her training, and her and her husband owned an aircraft, and she was going through the Aviation with me, and she said, you know, and she's just repeating all the requirements, and she actually had a VOR log, okay, and then she came to the altimeter, static. And I said, oh, can you show me that in logbook? Oh, did she look hard. She started sweating pretty quickly. Okay. Why did she not find it? What? Okay, well, do you need a pedostatic altimeter check for a VFR only aircraft? Well, they didn't. Okay. I put her over misery pretty quickly, okay? Because I hate to see people that uncomfortable. But think about it. Very clearly, her instructors never went through their own pilot aircraft logs to explain how Aviate applies. Okay? Now, the last one is just again pointing out the fact that what we teach is so pertinent to the real world. So I had a gentleman, he did a successful private pilot exam. He immediately bought a Skylane. And he was so proud of the Skylane that when I was back in the area a month later, he actually called me up and he said, hey, I'd like to show you my new plane. And let's go flying in it. I said, well, that would be nice. Now, he had been flying with a CFI for this whole month, put on quite a number of hours, but he hadn't been endorsed yet. He was actually, I know, kind of hoping I would give him his high performance endorsement. Okay, so first thing I said is, well, I can't get in the plane until we check the paperwork. Okay. He didn't have the registration. Ooh, he bought the plane. He had a bill of sale. Okay, that's what he tucked in there to be his registration. Okay. He had told me quite proudly the plane had brand new avionics, and I could see the nice new avionics. Okay. And he had some other things that I could see in the logbook. So I said, well, can you show me the weight and balance in the plane? He pulled it out. It was from 2018. Oh. Okay. Not the right weight and balance. Okay. So, and I asked him, I said, well, with these new avionics, do you have a supplement for that? Not in the plane. Yep, they were in his binder back home somewhere, he thought. Okay. Yeah, so we were able to reschedule, it took about 3 days for him to get this thing in order, but then he had been flying with the CFI for just about a month, and the paperwork was never checked. Now, what if something had happened? Well, that can be an issue. Okay? So again, make sure they understand this. Now, here's an important point, just a food for thought on the next slide. When someone solos, are they logging PIC? Oh, come on, you're afraid to nod your head. I'm not that tough. Okay, they're logging PIC, aren't they? Now, isn't the PIC responsible for the airworthiness? Right? Yeah, we can agree on that, right? And here's a little citation on that. So when are you teaching them to really assess airworthiness? Is it 2 days before their exam? Let's sit down and look at the aircraft logbooks for the first time. Right? Just a little food for thought on that, okay? So the thing is, if you start early and then you continue to build their system knowledge using scenarios, it's going to reap benefits.
If I may, for example, I flew 28 years of an airline, and I never looked more than inside the front cover of the logbook that had all the summaries on it. I never went in and signed in on the computer and looked at the whole computer program of all the maintenance that had ever been done on that airplane. I just looked at the summary. We have at our flight school, you open up the book that we fly with, it has the summary of everything, annual, geostatic, blah, 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 all that's there. We still have to go down to maintenance and get out the logbooks and everything like that.
Is it approved by the FAA?
Well,
the airline is a different situation.
The airline is approved by the FAA.
But we have a 141 school.
Right.
And to say, is it approved by the FAA, I would think that they know how we do our business, right? I mean, all of our dispatch procedures and everything that we have, if that's how we do it, then that should be approved, I would think. But it seems like every examiner comes in, no, go down to maintenance, drag out the logs, drag out all the logs, and so we do it, but I think, we shouldn't have to do that.
Well, if you think about it, is it important for your learner to know this? Are they ever possibly going to have their own aircraft? You know, what's the role modeling we're teaching them? It's like, oh, you just get a page, you look at that, and that's good enough.
You don't understand it.
Yeah.
Are you doing the check ride in their 141 or 61?
Right.
Well, in our school, we actually do both, but I'll say half of them are on the 141.
And I'll say most of the check rides I do are Part 61. Okay, and some, and as far as I've noticed that, really flight schools are tending to do a pretty nice job with maintaining good, accurate records where they do have summaries. But I have actually found in flight schools where maintenance was improperly recorded. Sometimes it's obvious, I mean, there was one case I'm like, well, gee, and I happen to know that mechanic, so I said, oh, let's take a break, called him up and said, could you come over here, please? So he came and he corrected an entry. Sometimes there's wrong dates on them. And what they signed off on has to be accurate, right? Now, again, does this mean I'm spending 2 hours going through the fine-tooth comb looking for errors? No, but sometimes there's things that are pretty obvious. It's just no one's really looking at them. Yeah, Doug?
Karen, do you ask your applicants to show you the requirements in their maintenance logs?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I found some applicants had never even looked at it.
Well, I find probably the most common scenario is, and believe me, again, I'm a flight instructor. I used to do this too, like 2 days before the check ride, you drag out and you go through them, and they're all tabbed up, right? And sometimes those tabs get out of date because no one's updated them either.
I pull them out every time.
Yeah. So you might consider having them be more aware of their responsibility. Remember, it's all part of building that PIC mentality. They can't just rely on their flight instructor to do everything for them because you're not going to be there. You've got to get those training wheels off at some point, right? And remember, you're role modeling for them. So, this is a biggie. 2 years ago, the FAA asked us as DPEs, they saw national what they want to focus on. They said, please put more time into assessing the knowledge of inoperative equipment, okay? So, it's actually a knowledge, a risk, and a skill area. You can't avoid it, right? Now, it's more than tomato flames, okay? So everyone knows this one, right? If I do the easy thing, it's like, oh, we went out to pre-flight and the landing light, it's not working. And right away someone will say, oh, tomato flames, we're fine. Right? Okay, so they're like, you just throw an inop sticker on it, right? And technically, the word they have in the regs is inoperative, by the way, but it would never fit. Maybe it's on the other side of the paper. All right, so that one's easy. But what if I tell them, gee, we also noticed the VSI look like that on pre-flight. Oh, okay. Now, maybe they memorized tomato flames and they're like, oh, we're good to go. We don't need it for a day VFR flight, right? But question is, what do? You just slap it on? Oh, now you're good to go, right? Because it's not in tomato flames, it's a required instrument. Okay, so let's do a super quick dive into what we do with inoperative instruments. Now, there used to be a really nice AC where they actually had a great flow chart, and they withdrew that like 8 years ago. I wish they'd replace it, but Now, if they understand this, if you read this reg 91.2.3, oh my God, it takes you forever. It's very confusing. But a quick synopsis, okay? So it's like a flow chart. So first of all, if you don't have a minimum equipment list, and actually in the private, fair game question is, what's a minimum equipment list? So the 90% answer is, oh, the minimum equipment has to be operating, which it's not, okay? Well, that's what it sounds like, okay? That becomes a little, just a debrief conversation. That's not a you failed if you don't know what an MEL is about. So if you don't have an MEL, which we don't in our trainers, then you've got this flow. So is it part of the type certificate, which you can find the type certificates on an FAA, on the FAA site, right? Is it in the aircraft equipment list or the KOEL? You know, if you have one for the newer aircraft, okay. Is there an AD that requires it? Now you're finally getting down to tomato flames, okay? That's 91.205, okay? There's your tomato flames, okay? But see, that's down the list, okay? So if after all of that, you don't need that equipment, what do? There's really two different things, okay? So you either can deactivate it. Okay. How do you deactivate? Landing light's easy. It's not flip it off, pull the circuit breaker, right? And mark it inoperative. Or remove it. Okay? So deactivation could be simple. But what about that VSI? Can a pilot deactivate a VSI? No. And that actually leads to another question, you know, which many times if they're really thoughtful, they're like, wait a minute, that's the pedostatic system. There could be something more going on than that VSI. Now I've asked mechanics, what does it take to remove a VSI? And they said, simple, it's about 20 minutes. We pull it out, we cap the line. And then they have to have the maintenance record, okay? And I have had people that actually knew all this is private.
Now, if you remove equipment, you have to update the weight and balance for that test. Sometimes say, hey, ADF that's not working. So you know it's not working, and I actually cut the pins out of it to make sure it was electrically deactivated.
Okay.
But if I just pull it out of the rack, technically it's inoperative and moved, but now the weight and balance isn't correct. Would you update weight and balance for that flight test, or how would you?
Well, now you're getting into that A and P, you know, relationship.
Right.
So yeah,
that's the.
You know,
that's why
I mean,
sometimes deactivating it's easier than removing it, is because now the weight and balance issue becomes an issue.
right, and that becomes, and it depends. But I think all of us, you know, I mean, you have mechanics in the field. You usually have friends who are mechanics, right? And lots of times they're just a phone call away, right? Okay, so let's talk about aircraft systems. Okay, this tends to be a fairly common, unfortunately, a weak area. Okay, so it's really easy to tell if someone's just memorized some stuff, right? In 1 week, I had 2 different people give me the same answer. So what should be one of those gimme questions? How many spark plugs in this 4-cylinder 4-banger? Well, of course, there's 4 spark plugs, right? One was a private candidate, the other one was a commercial candidate, okay? So I asked them both the same next question. Oh, 4 spark plugs. Yeah, because there's, you know, 4 cylinders.
Listen to magneto in op.
So I said, explain to me, explain to me what happens during a mag check. And the private candidate, bless his soul, he just thought for a minute and he went, oh, can I change my answer? And I said, sure, but still please explain to me what happens during mag check. Okay? Now the commercial candidate, unfortunately, I asked her just a few more pretty basic questions about systems. Didn't make it. Okay? And then she was absolutely amazed and appalled and said, I can't believe how in-depth your questions were. And I said, like, how many spark plugs? Yes! And believe me, they were basic questions, you know. Just mentioning more about mag checks. So why is this important? Okay, so I had a candidate, you know, he does a mag check, click, 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 like that, done. And I had noticed how much it dropped. So I said, what's the allowable, you know, RPM drop? And he goes, it's okay. And I said, well, isn't there a number? You know, most people kind of memorize that. And he goes, I said, where would you find that? So he pulls out the POH, he finds it, right? And he wisely decided to do another mag check. Well, it was outside tolerances. Yeah, the mag was going bad. Ooh, yeah, it was. Oh, there's a lot of things that happen. I've had in-flight alternator failures before taxiing out, an alternator failure. Real interesting vacuum pump failure where it was precessing. He even mentioned it 3 times we were taxiing out. It's like, geez, I have to reset that. It wasn't an instrument though. You know, so we were off 15 degrees by the time he was taking off. It was VFR. He struggled a bit, but he passed. But you know, come on.
Yeah.
Right? You should. They really give them scenarios. You know. Okay. So it's important for pre-flight decisions. I just recently had a gentleman. We taxied out, and during his run-up, he noticed that the ammeter was discharging. So we sat there for a really long time, mulling that over, not quite sure what to do. So, you know, my hand's kind of casually brushing a few things, right? So, you know, so then he finally decided, you know, it's like, well, it's not the green, so we're going back. So we taxied back, fairways. He turns into the parking spot, and now the ammeter's in the green. So he mulls over that for a while. Well, it's okay now. He goes, oh, that was probably just a glitch. So we should be good. So we taxi out again to the run-up area, right? So now the ammeter's overcharging, right? So that's a mull over for a while, right? So and he goes, I know I'm not supposed to ask you. And I just said, all available resources, right? So he calls his flight instructor, who just says, oh, you should talk to the mechanic. So we're waiting while he gets the phone number from the mechanic, calls the mechanic. Mechanic says, you know, probably a good idea not to go. Okay, while we're taxiing back in, now we're getting that acrid scent in the cockpit. Yeah, at least he was smart enough to shut things down, right? So yeah, is this important? And he really learned because he was so much wanted to go. Later he said, I can't believe that I probably would. He said, I was picking up vibes from you. And he said, I really wanted to go so much. He says, I can't believe that I really would have gone with that. And I said, remember that. Remember that. That's so important. Okay? So, and starting, oh my God, I can't tell you how many times and the RPM goes, right? Talk to them about the tolerances. Talk to them about how hard it is on the engine when they, you know, just race the engine when they start, you know, and backfires. Oh, that's a good way to get some carbon monoxide later, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and then in flight, like I said, things happen. They just happen. Give them scenarios so they know that things can happen. They're responsible for the lives of their passengers. You know, give them scenarios like, oh, this happened. What are you going to do about it? And then sit there and let them figure it out. And if they can't figure it out, give them some training. Okay. So again, the voltage regulator was the one I mentioned. So you've got all these systems. Have them read the systems. I've had too many times. I'll ask them, you know, what do you consider basic questions? You know, like, oh, what's the system volts? And they're like, oh, and they're like, can I look it up? So they're actually reading the system's description at that point in a check ride. That's kind of painful, right? All right, let's talk about emergency equipment. Okay, now there's various aspects to this. You know, everything from the fire extinguisher. Okay, that's a simple one, right? But if you think about it, what is really important, okay? Can this ever happen? This, by the way, is not a fatality. This was 2 minor injuries on this one, okay? So give them a scenario. The engine went out. You know, you can say more than that. I mean, I give a scenario where they're landing in remote terrain, okay? And before that, they had to troubleshoot, but then they kind of discovered the engine wasn't just overheating and they could cool it. It was actually loss of oil pressure. Okay, so now they landed in remote terrain. I can tell you, because I've recently done a study on this, ELTs, okay? The old ELTs, the original ones, 40% of the time they didn't activate. Your newer ELTs, 25% of the time they don't activate. The newest ELTs, the 406s, 15 to 18% of the time they don't activate the crash.
Wow.
And if you think about it, as I learned, I'm in CAP, those antennas break off easily. So there you go. Their cell phone they can't find, maybe it's dark, got lost in the snow. You know, there's some injuries involved with the passenger, usually the back seat, because they didn't have a shoulder harness, right? So, you know, we crawl in the plane, we all survived, yay! Fortunately, the plane didn't catch fire. So I say, okay, as PIC, what did you bring along on the plane to prepare for this contingency? What I usually get is water? Talk to them about it. Have them realize this is a reality. There's a lot of good survival articles. There's survival packs you can simply buy. This is one for aviation. You know, I always make a point. I carry a PLD and I teach them, every person I fly with, I say, I make sure they understand how it works, and I clip it here so it's accessible, it stays with us, and so it's also accessible for them very easily, okay? I mean, this is serious stuff. I talked to a flight instructor last month who, when he was 17 years old, he was a passenger in a plane close to Tahoe. If you know that, that's all mountainous. In winter, went down in icing conditions. The pilot was killed. He and another passenger survived 2 weeks waiting for rescue. And he said he knows if he wasn't 17 and the other gentleman was in his late 20s, broke his sternum. He said he knows if he had been a little bit older, he probably wouldn't have survived. Okay? He teaches survival training. So this is serious stuff. Okay. So let's talk about flight topics. All right? Okay. Now, I'm going to have to zip quickly because I see, you know, you can leave if you want. But you stay if you like. Okay, so let's talk a bit fairly quickly about some flight topics, okay? Again, I'm just selecting a few. Okay, please use those checklists, okay? So, for example, I had a gentleman and he was clearly, it was his own aircraft, he knew it thoroughly, clearly was not used to using checklists, but he was tense because of the exam, right? So, we're fairly high altitude, and when he was descending, skipped his descent checklist, so he didn't enrich in the mixture. Before landing, didn't enrich in the mixture, didn't check the checklist. Then he elected to do a go-around, didn't enrich the mixture. Now I know what can happen to your throttle cable if you fry it. You're not going to have working throttle. So I just couldn't resist. I went and put it in for him, okay? But again, checklist would have saved him. I have another gent on an instrument check ride and his own beautiful Mooney. I noticed on our initial takeoff, it was climbing 1,000 feet a minute. And this was into mountainous terrain. So he did a go around and he forgot to put the gear up. He did a flow, beautiful flow, right over the gear handle. And he had found, when I asked him if he had a checklist, he actually found one. He tucked it here, but he never pulled it out, okay? So after we were climbing about, you know, a minute, I said to him, "Hi, is this the performance you expect?" And he said, "No." And again, his hand went like this, right over the gear handle, okay? The gear stayed down. We were climbing 500 feet a minute. He actually had a dedicated terrain awareness screen, and it was turning yellow, but he was so busy setting up his avionics, he didn't notice it, okay? He would have flown right into a mountain, there's no doubt about it. And he knew it too. So if he would have used that checklist, it would have saved him and any passenger. You know, if you think about it, if it would have been IMC non-pilot passengers, he would have flown right into a mountain, CFIT. Now that's an impact. Yes.
What are your thoughts about creating your own checklist? For instance, the POH checklist doesn't match your flow that you're teaching us, so you make your own checklist that does match the flow. It covers everything in the POH, but it's in a different order. What are your thoughts?
I think that's a good idea. As long as you covered everything in the POH, you're good. Yeah. So you can't leave out anything, but you can make it work for you. And I'm a huge believer in the do and verify, flows and then verify. Okay, and again, that's my opinion. Okay, so again, remember the checklist. Oh, okay. Now, how would you feel? You're in the right seat. You look over and here's the scene that you see. Is there anything missing? You look at that whole view, you see everything, you see outside the window. Nothing's blocking your view, like hands. Right? I don't know what is going on, but I keep seeing this more and more recently. People are taxiing without a hand on the throttle and without a hand on the yoke. And they're being taught that way. And for an exam, all I can examine, technically, it says the controls are properly positioned for the current wind conditions. So if there's no wind, there's nothing wrong with this. But what if I say, you know, I mean, it's driving me nuts because I'm a tailwheel pilot, you know? And if y'all wait till we're taxiing by maybe a bigger plane and go, oh, I think they just started their engine. And then the smart ones go like, but, you know, please, things can come up, gusts can happen, other planes can start up. Please don't let them taxi with their hands off the controls. And then when I ask them, you know, what would I go like, oh my goodness, it looks like a gust picked up and here's the direction. And like, how would you position the controls? And then you see people going, and they're just trying to memorize something. So, you know, please work with them on that. It becomes really important, especially if they're ever going to do tailwheel training. They're way behind the power curve unless they've been doing this. And it becomes, yes, it's more work, but it becomes automatic. And then they're so much more cognizant of the impact of the wind. Okay? Of course, this is what we like to see. All right. Navigation, okay? So this is just a scenario. The fuel gauge is low. You don't know why, you know? Usually I'll say it's like, oh yeah, did you watch the plane this morning? I'm seeing some fluid like coming off the wing. So you got higher terrain. For some reason, like you can't return to the departure, you know, I can come up with a reason. What do? So obviously it's a diversion, right? But here's the point. This is right from your ACS. They have to do all of this, right? Notice what's in red. While they're maintaining their altitude plus or minus 200 and heading plus or minus 15. What I find, and I think it's because when we train, we're maneuvering so much, people tend to let their altitudes just wander like crazy. So when you're going to your practice area, just, you know, try distracting them. Remember, I have to distract them. It's actually kind of fun and easy. But, you know, just be quiet or do something distracting and see if they're maintaining that altitude, okay? Because they're going to be examined on it. Okay, situational awareness. This is what happens when people don't have situational awareness. Okay, so just a quick note on that. I'm finding, and of course, modern technology, we become so dependent on GPS, you know, that we tend to lose our situational awareness because, and they know they're tested on pilotage and dead reckoning, but for some reason, I don't know if that always is trained enough, because it's like they don't, you know, people tend to sweat when the GPS is off. In fact, some of the best candidates I get, and regularly I get them from the same CFI, he was a former Alaskan bush pilot, no GPS in any of his training aircraft. His people had the best situational awareness, and this airport's between two Class Charlies with not a lot of wiggle room. And those people are phenomenal. Private pilots, they know exactly where they are at all times. So again, try just turning that darn GPS off a bit and have them do pilotage and dead reckoning. It's fun, you know? It's like as kids, well, some of you are my age, you know, we'd actually in the car use maps to figure out where we're going. Okay. All right, stalls. Okay. It's right in the ACS. They're supposed to announce the impending signs of a stall. What does announce mean? It comes out of your mouth, right? Right? So, come on, you know what it is. So, you know, just have them say it, because it's right in the ACS. They're supposed to announce it, right? Not like, stall! Okay. Also, you know, so stalls have to go to the full brake for private, okay? For commercial, accelerated, no, but the other stalls for commercial, it's up to the examiner. So you can't have, and I've had commercial candidates, it's like, oh no, impending. And I go like, well, let's just take it to the full brake. No. Yeah, probably last time they did it was for their commercial check, or their private check ride, right? Yeah, and it's easy to tell someone's comfortable. Some people actually love stalling a plane and recovering, some are terrified. So what probably the biggest problem folks have is maintaining that 10 degrees of heading. Okay, that's going to be your rudder work also, and sometimes they're afraid. I see a lot of times they're afraid of the stall, so they'll pull the yoke back and they get close to the end, and then they'll let in a little bit, and then like full brake, and then the whole time the left turning tendency, the plane's turning, and now we're 30 degrees, and finally, you know, they recover and they go, Yeah, let's do that again. Yeah, let's do that again without the turn. Yes,
Can you
Doug.
test a turning stall? I tell all my
Okay.
applicants, one of the stalls will be a turn.
Yep.
And I'd probably say, oh,
Yep.
sorry.
Yeah. Oh, no, it's a good point.
Probably
Remember,
70% and never stall.
exactly, that's my next point. For private pilot, they can be asked to demonstrate that stall to a full brake up to 20 degrees of bank, okay? Then plus is they don't have to worry about maintaining 10 degrees of heading, right? So please,
Yeah, I'm gonna ask for a turning stall, I just wanted a turning stall.
yeah, so please practice turning stalls, because when I've asked candidates and they've never done it, they're scared. You know, or they go, I've done it once. You know, it's like, well, that's good, you get to do it again. You know? Okay, so,
Wrap it up.
yep, we're pretty much at the end here. So what can stall turn into spins? Okay, just pointing out, they need to understand the aerodynamics. If they understand the aerodynamics, that helps them understand how to recover. Pair, oh, okay, most everybody's memorized pair, but then they're struggling to remember what that is again. I've heard power on. Okay, they get the ailerons neutral. Okay, so if they just memorize it, I ask them and they say, and the elevator's like, yeah, elevator kind of centered. I go, well, okay, then we talk about, are you stalled? How do you recover from a stall? And then when I ask them, why is the elevator pushed forward? The common answer is, well, to increase the airspeed. And I say, well, if you want to increase the airspeed, why don't you leave the power in? Okay, that just tells me they really don't understand. So please explain what they're doing in pair. Okay, steep turns, just pointing out, again, kind of a common problem, primarily loss of altitude, but I see people trying to yank back the yoke, make sure they understand how that can devolve into a steep spiral on them, and that they really need to reduce bank before they recover the altitude, just a little bit. Also, 10 knots on the airspeed, so when you're doing the steep turns, watch that. Landings, just make sure they're on the center line. I've had people that have landed completely to the left of the center line. It's like, oh, are we on a highway? Okay, and all of the landings have a distance tolerance. Okay? Right. We think short, but your other ones are 400 feet. Okay, quickly, we've just got a few more slides, does attitude matter? I have heard these from candidates, okay? My instructor said to check this, I don't think it's needed. Okay, so that's kind of, well, here we go. I had one jet that said that to me as he was uncoupling a Cherokee, and he said to check the spark plugs, but I don't really think it's needed. 2 of the spark plugs were loose. You should have seen his jaw drop. Okay, nailed it. Doesn't that look like a great landing? I actually had a gentleman that landed completely to the left in the center line, where we bounced to a stop. Thank you, Cessna, for spring steel gear. I think this is his picture of himself, right? This is more like what it was in reality, okay? And this is what I look like. Okay? He had a chance to show me that one a few days later, okay? Okay, now this one, I know I'm not supposed to ask you, but is this a mature pilot? Okay. Is this a PIC? All right, so does attitude matter? Remember, what is a PIC? They have authority and the responsibility for the operation. Make sure they understand that, please. Okay? That's who you want to fly with. Okay, so thank you for bearing with me. One more slide. Exams can be fun. Okay? So this isn't me, but sometimes we look like that in exams. If they're prepared, they're confident, they're going to have a good time. Okay? Use the ACS in your training. Okay? Have them read that content before you go train, like steep turns. Okay? So there you go. Fly safely, happy.